Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our 2024 RAND debate. My name is Todd Anderson. I'm the principal here of Augustine College. For over 25 years, Augustine College has provided an 8-month post-secondary program right here in downtown, where Christians can learn to think through 3,000 years of literature, philosophy, art, science, and scripture. What is virtue? What is freedom? What have Christians believed through the centuries? What should we believe now? How will you be prepared to face the challenges of today and live as Christians in the public square? These are some of the questions that Augustine College is here to answer. And if you'd like some more information, you can go to our website, augustinecollege.org, or you can chat with me after our debate today. Before I invite my co-host, Barry Bussey from First Freedoms, to introduce the theme of the RAND debate, and our wonderful combatants, David Haskell and Bruce Pardy, let me explain briefly our program for you for this evening. So David and Bruce will each be given 10 minutes to make opening remarks and to make their case about virtue and freedom. And following this, we will enter an open format. They'll each have 45 minutes, which you can see will be marked up here for you to watch. They have a screen to keep track in front of them down here. And after that 45 minutes, they are done talking. As soon as one man sits down, the other man's clock begins. And so we'll see who comes out the victor in this debate. After we're finished, around 9 o'clock, you can head upstairs through this chamber to our Augustine College campus, where there's a bunch of food and some refreshments. And if you have any questions for either Bruce or David, you can ask them upstairs, okay? Thank you very much for joining us, and would you please join me in welcoming Barry to the stage? Come on.
You know, it's become a wonderful opportunity for both Augustine College. Working with Todd is just absolutely fantastic. His brother is, Josh, is there, our cameraman, and it's becoming more of a thing, as it were, with First Freedoms Foundation and also with Augustine College as we talk about the important ideas. I tend to be an idea person. I think my wife would prefer me to be more of an individual who's more concerned about earning money than about ideas, but ideas are one of the things that just kind of is extremely important. And when we were thinking about this idea of a debate, we came across an article written by a law professor, Bruce Pardy. Some of you may know him. So Bruce Pardy wrote an article called Freedom and Virtue, Friends or Enemies. So you need to be careful when you're writing, Bruce, because you could end up having to debate it. And it was really eye-opening, and I'm just going to read just a couple of paragraphs so that it sets the tone and why we're here tonight and why it's so important. And obviously, for so many people who are here present for this program, but also for the many who are watching live tonight. And we have a lot of people watching live. So this is an exciting night for us. In his article that was published by the Brownstone Institute, and also was in the Epoch Times, Bruce Pardy writes that there's an elephant in the room. So let's see if we can find that elephant tonight as we hear this debate. He talks about the virtue people who believe that virtue is the most important thing. Tradition, faith, family, responsibility, dignity, patriotism, community, and spiritual or religious conviction are the pillars upon which the West must be built. Virtue people are often, but not always, people of faith, especially of the Christian variety. Laws, governments, and society, they believe, should promote the true, the beautiful, and the good. But freedom people don't share this view. They believe that freedom is the most important thing. Virtues, they believe, are for individuals to work out for themselves. The primary accomplishment of the West, they would say, is individual autonomy. The purpose of government is to secure individual rights to liberty. Freedom means the absence of coercion. You may decide your values, actions, and groups for yourself, freedom means freedom from. Whereas virtue people, why, they believe in freedom, of course, especially in the era of illiberal progressivism, but freedom means a different thing to them. Freedom is essential, they would say, but the decline of the West is due to an excessive emphasis on individuality. And if that makes perfect sense to you, then you may be a virtue person. But if it sounds like a contradiction, you are probably a freedom person. Freedom, they would say, means the disciplining of desire, which requires limits, and freedom is the liberation to act responsibly, to be transparent, and flourish virtuously. We become free, they would say, to the extent that our will becomes coherent with objective good. Freedom means freedom to. That is going to be a debate tonight. Freedom from, freedom to. The issue of the freedom people and the virtue people. And our debaters tonight, many of you already know, Professor David Haskell is a professor of religion and culture at Laurier University. He's been there for 20 years, and he recently wrote a piece for Aristotle Foundation dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has received a lot of press, and I encourage you to have a look at it because he raises some very important points for all of us to keep in mind. And of course, Professor Bruce Pardy, law professor at Queen's University, who has been there for 24 years. And he's also the executive director of RightsProbe, and you can find more about his work at RightsProbe at rightsprobe.org. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome our debaters. So tonight we are going to be first having opening statements. David Haskell is going to have his opening statement first, followed by Bruce Pardy. And then we're going to get into the formal debate soon after.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm pleased to be here tonight because there's a problem, and it needs solving. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that all Western civilization hangs in the balance. What you will hear tonight, what gets resolved tonight, where we fall on this issue, I truly believe determines if we fall as a society. Now, to avoid an accusation of hubris, let me assure you, I don't think that this particular debate alone has the power to influence the direction of the West or even Canadian society. But I think it's a crucial part of a larger conversation that needs to be had immediately because Western civilization is sick. It's been infected by a disease. Some call it critical social justice, others call it cultural Marxism, or simply wokeism. But this disease is eating away at the body politic, and it will soon consume everything. The symptoms of this disease, this wokeism, as they manifest in our schools, our government organizations, and even in our businesses, is unmistakable. Symptom one, we see the elevation of any culture, any identity, any values that are not rooted in the culture and identity and traditional values of the majority population. On the other hand, and we can call this symptom number two, we see the explicit degrading of the majority population and the values and the culture of their heritage. In particular, the ideas and values rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition are uniquely demonized. A third major symptom of this wokeism is the rationalization or valorization of discrimination. It insists that discrimination is a good thing if applied against the majority population. So to my mind, those are the major symptoms of wokeism. And I believe that left untreated, the hostility and division it causes will increase until our nation dies. But if that is the disease, then what's the cure? What's the most effective cure? And by cure, I mean to say, what's the most effective ideological system to reverse, push back the damage of wokeism and restore our country? Because make no mistake, at its core, this battle for our country is a battle of ideological systems or worldviews. And if we want to win against this cancerous worldview of wokeism, we need to employ the strongest, most effective worldview to war against it and then replace it. Note that I said the most effective worldview. Tonight you're going to hear about two competing cures for the disease of wokeism. You're going to hear about conservatism from me. In particular, the conservatism I'm advocating is of a very specific type. It's the conservatism that is rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition, informed by British common law and native to all English-speaking countries. In very simple terms, as a political philosophy, the conservatism that I am advocating could be described like this. It's the virtues and values of Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity, applied to the governing of a country. I make special reference to Protestantism because it's from this religious tradition that conservatism from the UK and the US and Canada develops its strong tradition of individual liberty. Protestants fought to be able to believe and behave freely apart from their religious masters. Thus, liberty is a core characteristic of the conservatism I'm describing. And while conservatives in the Anglo-speaking countries are fierce defenders of freedom, they are guided by their religious tradition to balance their love of personal liberty with duty to family and duty to their nation. So with all of this in mind, I'll wrap up my definition of conservatism as a political philosophy. A government that leads according to conservative ideals will focus on the promotion of freedom, but it will be tempered by traditions of faith, protection of family, and the success of the nation. And this needs to be said. A conservative does not need to be religious, though many are, but they must support the virtues of the Judeo-Christian tradition because they recognize that they lead to the greatest societal success. So that's conservatism. From Bruce, you're going to hear about classical liberalism. Both worldviews have merit. But I'm going to show you that only one of these positive worldviews is strong enough medicine to heal the body politic and restore our nation. Conservatism, rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition of the Anglosphere, is the only political ideology with a detailed map that leads out of the wokeness wilderness and back to a flourishing civilization. Classical liberalism is to be praised for its defense of individual liberty, but that is the extent of what it does. Demanding individual freedom is not a detailed map. At best, classical liberalism is a single line on the page. Above the line, written in positive green ink, is the phrase individual freedom. Below the line in negative red ink is the word restrictions. For the classical liberal, they feel that the first duty of government, and maybe its only role, is to promote policies that fall above the line. For the classical liberal, the freedom of the individual is the highest good, and therefore government should make protecting individual liberty their first responsibility. And again, that position, no matter how enticing in its simplicity, is not sufficient to deal with our current reality. Because here is our current reality. Society is literally falling apart. More specifically, good is being called evil, and evil is being called good. From encouraging suicide for people who are depressed to mutilating children who are confused, think of any of the hundreds of current claims that are being made by progressives. We are in a society where good is called evil and evil is called good. You cannot make personal freedoms the first priority of government when society has literally forgotten the core virtues that make personal freedom beneficial and sustainable. Classical liberalism wants government to promote unfettered individual liberty. But the absence of virtue, in the absence of the knowledge of the good, well, when you have unfettered personal freedom, well, that's going to lead to the end of freedom itself, and ultimately societal ruin. Of course, there are going to be those who yell, "Hey, why do you get to decide what good is? Why should government promote your idea of virtue?" And my answer is very simple: because it worked. You don't have to be a religious person to recognize factual evidence. Look at the countries of the world that produce the greatest prosperity, equality, and freedom for their people. The single common denominator in that was in their past, they actively and explicitly promoted Judeo-Christian virtues using the principle of toleration, which accompanies Anglo-conservatism. But now compare. It's been just two generations, around 60 years, since explicit Christian virtues have been removed from the public sphere. It's been 2 generations since the ideas of classical liberalism and its focus on freedom alone have reigned. And now we can't even determine whether women exist in reality. Here's what the conservative sees. The conservative looks at the classical liberal's scrap of paper with its single line on it, dividing good freedom from bad restrictions, and the conservative pushes that paper aside. And he pulls out his detailed map. The conservative points out that individual liberty is on his map, but there are a number of necessary stops along the way before you can reach that destination. In fact, the conservative knows that individual liberty can only be a temporary destination if you don't get there by a very specific route. It is a route that must run through the Judeo-Christian tradition, because over thousands of years it's been tested and proven that it truly is best for societal flourishing. And it's a road that's traveled as part of a family and part of a nation, because on that journey with your family and with the community of nation, you learn about mutual loyalty and your obligation to assist one another. Classical liberalism says, give me my personal freedom. Conservatism says, yes, give me my personal freedom, but let's use my map showing how to get to be free together for the greatest societal flourishing. Individually alone cannot help a nation in crisis, but conservatism can. Thank you.
Can you hear me all right? Okay. Thank you for coming. David Haskell is one of the best human beings that I know. He has made himself a servant of God, of his family, of his community, of his country. But Dave is also a conservative. And many conservatives carry something dark inside their hearts. And that is this: the conviction that everyone must live like them. Dave and I are buddies. If you hear the occasional jab or insult tonight, you can take it as a term of affection. We agree, the two of us, about a great many things. But we don't agree about this. And as Dave suggested, this may be the thing upon which the fight turns. Because there are these two forces working together to try and resist the woke, to try to resist the dissolving of Western civilization. Now, this debate is put in terms, as Barry was describing, of virtue versus freedom. But that is not the specific question that is in front of us. One might argue that as the so-called, and I've called them this, the so-called virtue people would say, that in order to be free inside your heart or in your mind, that perhaps you must be virtuous first. That maybe you need discipline, maybe you need insight, so as not to give in to your base desires or your animal instincts. Maybe so. That is not the question this debate is about. So what is it about? Here's the resolution. Be it resolved that as wokeism destroys the West, the first responsibility of government is to foster a virtuous society rather than to protect individual liberty. What is the most important word in that resolution? It's not virtue, and it's not liberty. The most important word in the resolution is government. This debate is about whether the government should require you to behave virtuously. I have news. That's what it's doing now. A while back, I caught up with an old friend. She was having romantic trouble, wanted to talk. It was a fairly new relationship, and she wasn't happy with the way it was going. Here's what she said to me, and these are her exact words. She said, "He won't take charge in the relationship. And when he does," she said, "he does it wrong." I may have laughed. And I laughed because it's absurd. Why is it absurd? Because you want two things at once. You want to give somebody control, and then you want to control how they do it. If you give somebody control, they have control over what happens. And that's the way government works. If government is going to foster a virtuous society, it's going to foster a virtuous society that it thinks is virtuous. And that's what it has been doing. Now, I know the conservatives will say, well, that's not what we mean. We don't mean those virtues. We mean these virtues. But you don't get to pick, because the mandate is the thing that you've given, the job. You've given the government. The government is there, you say, to do this fostering. And by the way, there is no action that governments take that is not coercive. We can get more into that a little bit later. As Thomas Sowell said, the most basic question is not what shall be done, but who decides what shall be done. Dave's answer is the government. And my answer is you. You shall decide what happens in your life and how you choose to behave. And in any event, The conservatives seem to have a very strange idea about what virtue is. As I said, Dave has made himself a servant of God, family, community, country. And how did he do that? Well, I don't know exactly. But he came to understand something and then made a choice. Perhaps conservatives haven't watched enough Harry Potter. Sirius Black, the character that turns into a wolf, says this to Harry Potter. He says, "The world is not divided into people who are good and people who are bad. We all have light and dark within us. What matters is the part we choose to act on." And the most important words in that statement are, we choose. Virtuous behavior requires the freedom to choose. The virtue is in the choice that you make. If you are not allowed to make the choice, you're not virtuous, you're obedient. A virtuous society requires that your government stick its nose somewhere else and allow you to make your decisions over your own life. And it's the only way forward, and it's the only way out of this dilemma that we have. If these forces who are opposed to the collapse of Western civilization are to triumph, then we have to get onto the same page. And the problem is that the classical liberals, or the people who are inclined that way, think that our problem is too little freedom. And the conservatives that Dave represents believe that the problem is too much. Thank you very much.
Now, Bruce has called into question whether or not we need a government. So we have to make a choice, and we have to say, do we want to go back to tribalism? You see, you have three choices when we look at how a country is governed. You can either be globalist, which is an imperialist, which says that everybody in the world is going to be under a central authority. We saw it with Rome. The Nazis tried that. Then we had nationalism. Nationalism said that, yes, we agree that as a people we'll agree to be governed. The alternative is tribalism. And that seems to be what Bruce is suggesting. Because outside of a governing system, you get tribalism. And a governing system says we actually need to agree on a set of values and virtues that will unify our population. Now, what he's suggesting is that the Judeo-Christian tradition that I'm advocating isn't sufficient. So let me dig into that a little bit. I'm arguing that the government's first responsibility should be the promotion of virtue. And I've been very clear about the kind of virtue the government should be promoting. It's virtue that explicitly reflects the Judeo-Christian tradition. And if you're someone who doesn't practice Christianity, you may be hesitant to support that position. But as I've already explained, you don't need to believe in Christianity to support my position. You just need to believe in evidence. And the countries of the world with the highest standards of living, the greatest security, the most personal freedom, and the maximal tolerance and equality, regardless of creed or color, have one thing in common. They were nations in which a supermajority of the population was Christian. And the laws and traditions of that country, up until about 60 years ago, explicitly reflect the virtues and values of Christianity. When we look at immigration in the world today and how it runs only one way towards nations founded on Christian virtue, we see that people outside the West are convinced by the evidence. But there may be some in this audience, certainly Bruce, who's not convinced. In fact, some of you may be thinking, if it's applied today, if Christianity is applied today as it was in the past, it's going to make society worse, not better. Luckily, this is a topic that I've been researching for about 20 years. So let me put on my hat as a sociologist of religion, and I'll rattle off a few facts, and it'll allow us to more closely examine how Christianity today impacts society. In Canada and the United States, study after study has shown that Christians, specifically conservative Christians, give more to charity and volunteer more than any other group. In Canada, according to Statistics Canada, practicing Christians have charitable giving 3 times that of non-religious, and they volunteer twice as much and for 40% more time. In the mid-2000s, the Red Cross did a study of charitable work done by religious organizations in the developing world. They found that unlike other aid organizations doing charitable work, Christian organizations, quote, assisted anyone regardless of their religious affiliation. Let's move on to internal relationships. Practicing conservative Christians in the West have the highest levels of satisfaction and stability in their marriage. According to the work of sociologist Nancy Gallagher, conservative Christian fathers most actively engage in the raising of their children. Children raised in the homes of practicing Christians, on average, have the highest levels of pro-social behavior, the lowest levels of antisocial behavior, and the lowest levels of addiction. Conservative Christian families have significantly less domestic abuse and child abuse than the population at large. According to numerous studies, men who are practicing Christians are about 70% less likely to abuse their female partners. Similarly, a recent study at Harvard and Redeemer University showed that Christian universities in Canada and in the US have the lowest incidence of sexual assault. Let's look at some specific attitudes necessary for wider societal functioning. For society to function, people must be able to get along. They need to forgive each other when they mess up. Among groups in the West, conservative Christians have been shown to be the most supportive of forgiveness for those who have harmed them. Recent surveys by Harvard and Gallup show that close to 90% of Christians agree forgiveness is very important. In experiments involving actual forgiveness conducted at the University of North Iowa, Christians in the samples, quote, emerged significantly further in their forgiveness process toward a specific offender than Muslims and atheists in the sample. And while Christians excel at forgiveness, polling by Pew Research shows progressives, in general, are 3 times more likely to end a friendship over a political position. Now let's move on to mental states. Practicing conservative Christians, on average, have the highest levels of happiness and life satisfaction in North America. This is also the case in Europe. In fact, Carol Graham of the Brookings Institute found in European communities, the happiness of those who were not religious increased when living in areas with a greater proportion of practicing Christians. In addition to cornering the market on happiness, conservative Christians who attend church regularly have among the highest scores of mental wellness. Related to mental health, the effect also goes in the opposite direction. According to a 2020 study by Pew Research, the highest rates of diagnosed mental illness is found among progressives. For example, 56% of progressive white women aged 18 to 29, 56% have been diagnosed with a mental health condition. Let's move on from mental states to physical actions. According to research by Baylor University sociologist Byron Johnson, practicing conservative Christians have the lowest rates of crime in the United States. In his study of convicts at prison, Dr. Johnson also found that the most effective treatment programs for rehabilitation were those that were explicitly Christian and taught Christian virtues. On the other hand, in a massive study using national data sample, researchers at the University of Cincinnati found the more someone identifies as a liberal, the higher their level of criminal participation. Now, let me slow down a bit. Christian virtue has a significant effect on crime reduction. You'd think that the government might be interested in that. But they're not. But at least we have diversity and inclusion. Let's move from the data at the level of the individual to data at the level of countries, because Bruce has caused us to question whether the virtues of Christianity and conservatism will work at the country level. We already know, it's very popular knowledge, that slavery in both Britain and in the United States was abolished because of the political activities of conservative Christians. In fact, related to the US, in 1993, Robert Fogel won the Nobel Prize because he found political activism of conservative Christians in America was the single greatest factor in freeing the slaves. But that was in the past. Is there any way to determine if practicing Christians today are still the champions of freedom and equality for all? Well, let me see if I can give it a try. 5 years ago, Pew Research Center surveyed citizens from across the world and asked about their support for freedom of expression. Here's what they found. It turned out that the countries with the greatest number of Christians had the greatest support for freedom of expression. The number one country for number of Christians is the United States, also has the greatest support for freedom of expression. In Europe, the number one country for practicing Christians is Poland, again, greatest support for freedom of expression. I'm going to refer to just one last study. And again, we're looking at, does Christian virtue produce freedom? We need a government. We need it to give us something to hold on to and some values to uphold. So let me talk about the work of Dr. Robert Woodbury. Dr. Robert Woodbury, professor at Baylor University, wanted to discover, why does one country become free and democratic when another, often directly beside it, with similar geography, cultural background, natural resources, why does that country suffer from authoritarian rule when another is democratic, liberal, free? So to determine that answer, he spent 14 years assembling historical, demographic, and economic data on nations of the developing world. Finally, in 2012, he published the summary of his findings in the American Political Science Review, one of the top journals for political science. The title of his article is this: The Missionary Roots of Liberal Democracy. Here's the startling discovery that Dr. Woodbury made. Historically and statistically, the political and social activism of conservative Protestant missionaries in developing nations was the single greatest influence on the rise and spread of stable democracy. According to Woodbury's empirical findings, these conservative Protestants who engaged in political and social activism were, quote, a crucial catalyst initiating the development and spread of religious liberty, mass education, mass printing, thereby creating the conditions that made stable democracy more likely. So, does Christianity applied to politics assist freedom? Should a government support those kind of virtues? I leave Bruce with a challenge. What is your empirical evidence that classical liberalism produces societal flourishing?
We need a government. Now, I have some friends, good friends, who are anarchists, anarcho-capitalists, and they make a good case. I'm not quite there yet. But the liberal position, I'm going to use the word liberal as opposed to classical liberal, because liberal is the word that meant those people who supported the idea of liberty. So don't get confused between the two different versions of liberal. We're not talking about the modern, illiberal, progressive liberal who's woke. I'm not that kind of liberal. I'm the liberal who thinks that you own your own life. So we need a government, and we all need values to live by. But those two things are not the same thing. Your values don't come from the state, for God's sake. Humans are spiritual animals. And I think Dave is right that the evidence probably does show that people who have a spiritual understanding of something, a belief system, who are maybe members of a religious community, probably on average fare better. I don't doubt that. I don't know for sure, but I don't doubt it. Once again, that is not the question here. I am not arguing against Christianity. Just to be clear, here's the classical liberal position. It is not that you should live your life as an atomized individual without relationships. No. You should form relationships with the people around you, with friends and family, with community, with religions. You should come together with people who think like you, who believe like you. If you want to, live according to a code. If you want to strike a community covenant, then great. As long as what you do is voluntary. You are forming voluntary relationships with your friends and family and community and church. You don't want to be made, do you? That's what we're talking about. What we're talking about is a legal order in which the government will not allow you to do certain things because a certain group doesn't like it. What distinguishes the West from the rest? Christianity has been around for a long time. Its record is sometimes pretty good and sometimes not so hot. The idea of a common set of values, social norms, is an idea that civilizations of all kinds through the ages have had. It's not unique to the West. What is unique to the West? Not conservatism, not tradition, not religion. The thing the West did in a way that no other civilization has ever done is recognize individual autonomy. You know, as the woke make their progress and things start to change, you know how this civilization is starting to be referred to. The term you will hear sometimes is post-liberal, not post-conservative, post-liberal. Because liberalism is what we've had. Liberalism is what it's done. Now, I don't mean to say that conservative ideas have not had a part. Of course they have. For the past 200 years. In a way, liberal and conservative ideas have been the yin and the yang of Western civilization. But if you lose the idea of being able to decide for yourself the values by which you want to live, then we really are in a post-liberal society. Here's the thing. I don't want to live under the thumb of the woke. But I don't want to live under the thumb of the conservatives either. I don't want to be told what to do. If you believe in liberty, you really have to come to two epiphanies. The first one is easy. The second one is not. The first one is this. I don't want to be told what to do. I don't want to be told how to live. That one's easy. Here's the hard one. I don't want to tell others how to live. If you don't have that second one, you don't really get it. And that second one is hard, because it's a natural human inclination to want to control other people. And that is the plan that Dave is describing.
Has told us, well, first of all, here's what he didn't tell us. I asked him a specific question. I said, Bruce, can you show us the empirical evidence that classical liberalism leads to societal flourishing? And he didn't mention anything. I know I probably bored you with about 5 minutes of empirical evidence, and that was just a taste of what's out there related to the goodness that has flown societally from the Christian tradition. But he didn't give us anything. But he did make a comment, and I want to trace that comment about and tease it out a little bit. He says, your values should not come from the state. And to a certain extent, he's right. Your values should not come from the state. They should come from your mom and dad. They should come from your religious community. They should come from maybe some influential mentors. But we have to realize that your values do come from the state. Now, as a classical liberal, Bruce has told us that governments have no business promoting one virtue over another. I'm saying, as a conservative, there has to be a time and a place for such government action. And not only that, the reality is that it's going to happen because we don't want tribalism and we live as a nation, so we expect government to do its job. I said that we're in a most pressing time because society has begun to confuse evil for good. And at times like this, when evil is confused for good, when people can't recognize the difference between the two, government needs to perform a signaling function. In fact, the signaling function of government can be its most important role in times like this. Now, when social scientists talk about the signaling function of government, this is what they mean. What government promotes as permissible and honorable and normative, most in the population will too. And here's a very important variable to understand. When traditional institutions of moral instruction, like churches or schools, are either avoided or ethically compromised, government as a signaler of what is good and what is not becomes even stronger. The role becomes even more important. You see, people can choose to avoid church, but nobody avoids government. So to paraphrase a line from the book of Genesis, what the government blesses, the people will bless, and what the government curses, the people will curse. Now, the most vivid, or what I would say brutal example of government moral signaling was the hatred that our rulers were able to generate against those skeptical of the COVID vaccines. But there are more subtle examples. I'll give you what I think is the most famous Canadian example of the success of government signaling. In 2005, Canada became the 4th country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage. This new law in 2005 did not enjoy a groundswell of support from the Canadian people. The courts were the one who demanded that it happen. But most Canadians didn't want it. Polling by Angus Reid Group and several others showed that 60% of Canadians did not want legalized same-sex marriage at the time. But once the law was in place, once the government had morally signaled that same-sex marriage was permissible, honorable, and normative, Canadian people followed their lead. In just 5 years, by 2010, the numbers had switched. Before, 60% had opposed. Then 5 years later, 60% of Canadians surveyed agreed same-sex couples should be able to legally marry. We also have other examples of government signaling. The desire and the acceptance of MAID, the government-supported suicide, increases by about 30% a year. And because of government signaling that it is normative and positive, we now have actually expanded the idea of MAID to those who are not just terminally ill, but mentally suffering. That's a huge change. That's a government signal. Also, we saw in the legalization of marijuana, the British Medical Journal has said that since the legalization of marijuana in Canada, we've seen the greatest increase in use by youth, because youth are the most susceptible to government signaling. And not only that, a study that was published in it was the Canadian Journal of Health, it showed that now the instances of psychotic breaks that come from marijuana in Ontario hospitals, as measured by visits to the emergency room, are up by 250%. So that's an example of government signaling, something that is permissible. So we have to challenge Bruce, who's told us that government has no place. Certainly, there are other institutes, churches, families that do have a place, but the place of government is undeniable. Let's stop pretending. Even when a government says nothing, it's saying something. In its silence, it's saying this is okay too. The conservative knows one way or another the government is doing moral signaling. So the conservative political position is to accept that reality and have the government promote ideas based on time-tested truth and clear evidence of social flourishing. As a government operating under conservative principles, not classical liberal, the government's not ashamed to say the traditional values and culture that made the West the most free, the most fair, the most successful should not be abandoned. In fact, they should be celebrated. But here's the problem for Bruce. Bruce has already told us that the classical liberal can't do that. A government following classical liberal principles must not do that. A government run under classical liberal principles has to be neutral and not choose sides. Classical liberals are not as bad as progressives, because progressives hate traditional Western values and culture. But over time, classical liberals are just as dangerous, because classical liberals are moral relativists when it comes to the public sphere. When you ask a classical liberal, should a Western government promote Western values? They have to answer no. But conservatives know if you leave the public sphere as an ideological vacuum, some other ideology will come to fill it. Bruce has told us there's no such thing as a sin for a classical liberal, except to say that something is a sin. So Bruce, I'm confused. Can you tell me, how does a classical liberal government get us out of this mess when classical liberals insist that government should not advance a specific moral choice?
So I think some things are pretty clear. Dave's been very explicit about what he means. And I agree with him about what he means. And the choice is whether or not we can stomach it. Dave's not talking about virtue, not in the sense that I described, where the hero comes along and then tries to make a decision about whether to go to the light side or the dark side. Those are not the choices that are being presented. The choice is to have our government prescribe behavior. In other words, Dave is describing conservatives not as virtue people, but as coercion people. We are going to make you behave this way. Now, if you're up for that, then there's no reason why you shouldn't go along with that. But let me tell you this. You are doing exactly the same thing as the woke, just different content. And this is the thing that progressives and conservatives have in common. Oh, their particular ideas about what's good are completely different. But they both share the conviction that they know best what is right for everyone. And God damn it, they'll make you do it. They've asked for evidence. Here's some evidence about what has happened in the past when conservatives were ascendant in the culture. We had prohibitions on gay sex. We had prohibitions on the consumption of alcohol. Interracial relationships were frowned upon. We had segregation. We had punishments for obscenity, censorship for heresy. Now, I know that today the conservatives have moved on. They're not proposing those particular things today. That's not my point. My point is that they will make the law whatever it is they disapprove of. The content doesn't matter. Frederick Bastiat said this: the legislator bears the same relationship to mankind as the potter does to the clay. But no one wants to be the clay, and everyone wants to be the potter. The conservatives want to be the potter, and they want us to be the clay. I don't want to be clay. I do not want to do what a conservative sensibility requires me to do, not because I don't approve. A lot of the things that David's describing make a lot of sense to me in terms of values. But my opinion of whether they are right or wrong is completely irrelevant. Why? Because I am not God and I am not king. And so when somebody else wants to go off and do something that they think is right and that I think is wrong and has no effect upon me at all, I am not about to want to have a law that says they can't. Now, what about responsibility? Because this is a favorite theme of conservatives. We have to have people who have responsibility as well as freedom. What about responsibility? If you have a liberal order, and I mean that in the original sense, then you have responsibility by definition, because you have the freedom to make your own voluntary choices. If you decide to do something stupid, the responsibility is yours. That's what keeps people in line. It's what we don't have today. Responsibility and control always go together. If brother borrows the car and bangs it up, and sister gets in trouble, Sister says, but hold on, I wasn't the one driving it. Brother had control of the car. Brother, therefore, has responsibility. The two things travel together. So the conservative claim that the liberal order does not produce responsibility is bunk, absolute bunk. It's only in this leftist, illiberal, progressive, woke environment in which the state rushes in to take away responsibility for the bad choices people make. And I'll add one more thing. In our liberal order, freedom is universal. That means everybody has it. One of the difficulties with the woke situation we now have is that is not true. People are being given the freedom to make all kinds of claims or make all kinds of choices. For example, to claim to change their gender. Now, in a liberal order, you can do what you want. If you want to do that, you're free to do it. You can call yourself a woman if you want. But everybody else is free too. And they can see you as they see fit and call you what they want. That's what universal freedom means.
I hate to beat a dead horse, but I'm trying to figure out when Bruce is going to tell me what the empirical evidence is that classical liberalism has any track record of societal flourishing. Where's the proof? I've given him the first chance, and then I said, Bruce, show me that classical liberalism can get us out of this mess. And he hasn't done it. I said, how? How does classical liberalism, with its moral relativism, with its refusal to actually take a stand, how does it get us out of the woke wilderness? And he hasn't told us. At least he didn't tell us here. But happily, he has told us in an article he wrote. We heard a little bit from his article on freedom people, classical liberals, versus the virtue people. And I'm going to have to use it to pull out some of the things that Bruce has said about how classical liberalism tells us it's going to get us out of the woke wilderness. So I'm quoting from the essay itself. The essay outlines the difference between the beliefs of classical liberals and conservatives. And in it, Bruce explains the belief that the classical liberals hold, and he tells us why it's the preferred position. Bruce says that classical liberals, whom he calls freedom people, are to be preferred because, unlike conservatives who promote time-tested objective good, classical liberals make no such effort. He's told us this again and again. He says, the freedom people do not impose their moral judgments on others. The freedom people do not impose their moral judgment on others. Now, if you've ever been a teenager, you can see the appeal of that. You're not going to tell me what to do. But you have to think, with that position, you're not asking anything of anyone. And it does force the question. If you're not asking anything of anyone, how do you ensure that the best things, the beneficial things that lead to societal flourishing will take place? Well, here's the answer that Bruce provides in his article. This is how classical liberals ensure societal flourishing. Freedom people, that is the classical liberals, have faith in spontaneous order. If we leave people alone, freedom people believe things will turn out fine. Individual decisions will coalesce into peace and prosperity. Now, do any of you believe that? In your experience, has it proven to be true that things just work out fine that individual decisions will magically organize themselves into a spontaneous order if you just leave people alone. And as you mull that over, think of downtown San Francisco, think of downtown Seattle. For that matter, think of downtown Toronto or downtown Vancouver. Now, for those of you who can't imagine those places because you don't watch the news or you don't get out very much, let me paint a picture for what you're missing. Picture stores closing because they're robbed into bankruptcy. Picture open drug use in every park and even outside of schools. Picture tent cities and panhandlers. Picture police telling citizens, hang your keys close to the front door so you can avoid being assaulted when the gang members arrive at your home. I'm serious when I say that I want to stick as close as possible to reality. I want to give you some direct quotes from some recent news articles about what's going on in San Francisco. This is from National Public Radio. The streets are so filthy that at least one infectious disease expert has compared the city to some of the dirtiest slums in the world. Here's what NBC said about San Francisco. Trash found, this is about downtown streets. Trash found included large heaps of garbage, food and discarded junk, as well as 100 drug needles and more than 300 piles of feces, human feces, throughout downtown. The report concluded the accumulation of human feces has become nearly as much a symbol of San Francisco as streetcars. Can you imagine that on a t-shirt? With that reality fresh in our mind, here's what you need to know about that growing list of failed cities in North America. All of them are putting into practice the exact recipe for society that classical liberals want applied everywhere. Now, I'm not saying that those politicians running those cities are classical liberals. They are not. They're not classical liberals, they're just liberals, or what we now call progressives. But classical liberals and liberals, now called progressives, share some common beliefs, as is reflected in their original names. The progressive politicians running these failed cities, like classical liberals, are absolutely committed to the idea that spontaneous order is going to arise from the rampant crime and drug use. They're committed to the belief that if you leave people alone, things will turn out fine. And like the classical liberals, they are absolutely opposed to any public endorsement of the historically vindicated virtues embodied in the Judeo-Christian tradition. I think it's incredibly interesting to note that San Francisco and Seattle, in addition to leading U.S. cities in social ruin and non-judgmental policies, they also have the lowest levels of practicing Christians in America. So as you think of San Francisco and Seattle and Toronto and Vancouver, ask yourself, do you believe that classical liberals, when they claim societal flourishing will return through spontaneous order, is it true? Do you believe that drugs and crime and feces will coalesce into peace and prosperity? Is that reality? Do you believe it? Conservatives don't. Conservatives don't believe you can leave the public sphere a moral vacuum, making no claims of what's good, and expect everything to turn out fine. Instead, based on thousands and thousands of years of historical evidence, conservatives believe if you pretend that all moral choices are equal and you leave the public sphere a moral vacuum, you will not get spontaneous order, but you will get San Francisco. So, I'd like to give Bruce an opportunity. Bruce, what am I missing? Can you show me where that classical liberal dream of spontaneous order has become a reality? Where?
Yeah, why? Dave is talking about San Francisco. Not a clue. There's no classical liberal order in San Francisco. San Francisco is a woke city. What do I mean by spontaneous order? We're not talking anarchy, like I referred to earlier. We are talking about the other choice in this debate. Let me go back to the resolution. The two choices are this. Government does one thing or the other. Here are the two choices. The government requires a virtuous society, as in virtuous behavior, or government protects individual liberty. It hasn't done that for a long time. If it was doing that, what we would have is peace and protection of your property rights, of your person, of your ability to decide for yourself, your ability to interact with your community. Spontaneous order means peace. No violence, no trespass. And officials enforce the law. I am not making a case against the law here. I'm making a case against moralistic busybodies. Even people of the church don't approve of this. C.S. Lewis, of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. We are still talking about coercion. We are still describing an order in which there isn't just peace. There isn't just property rights. There isn't just choice in the religion that you choose and the spouse that you choose and the interactions that you choose. All of those things are classical liberal ideas. A peaceful society in which people interact safely and under the rule of law. That is not what David's describing. David's describing an order in which certain religious people get to say what we're all allowed to do. I don't want to live there. Now, Dave brought up the idea of objective good. It's a favorite of certain kinds of Christians and also certain kinds of conservatives. Objective good. It's a very dangerous phrase. Why? Here's why. Let's assume that such a thing exists. I think it probably does. And you know what? I know what it is. And to the extent that your moral code conflicts with mine, you're wrong. Can you see the problem? Even if there is an objective good, nobody can say what it is. And if everybody has a slightly different idea about what it is, what you get is conflict and violence. Because people are sure that their idea of this thing called objective good is the right one. And there are as many ideas of that as there are people. So even if there is objective good, we must govern ourselves as though there is not. Because the only other alternative is violence, force, and conflict. I have nothing to do with San Francisco, nothing to do with Portland, nothing to do with Toronto. The governing regimes in those places have nothing to do with classical liberalism. What you would get with classical liberalism is an order in which people are free and safe and live comfortably under a rule of law and able to make their own choices.
I'm glad that Bruce brought up C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is a Christian philosopher, quite prolific, was writing in the 1940s, 1950s. And he did mention that it's worse to be governed under someone who thinks that they're doing the right thing. You know, people who are operating under that because they never stop. Their conscience is clear. So I love that quote. I love another quote by C.S. Lewis as well. Now, I'm going to have to go from memory, so it's going to be a paraphrase. But he also said that the reason he supports democracy is not because it puts the power into the hands of the people. It's because it puts the power into the hands of many people. He said, I don't trust people. I don't trust people. What I trust is the taking of power and spreading it out so that no one person can do damage. But what he did say he trusted was the 1,000 upon 1,000 upon 1,000-year history of the biblical tradition that test and retest showed what was good for society. So where we can go with C.S. Lewis is to a very specific point. That we shouldn't trust ourselves. I agree with Bruce. We shouldn't do that. Instead, we should look to thousands of years of history. You see, the conservative, here's what the conservative does. The conservative says, I'm playing chess. And the classical liberal says, I'm playing checkers. You see, the classical liberal, they make one move. The conservative, they see the whole board. And because of the map, or in this case, let's use the metaphor, because of the guidebook that's been passed down through tradition for thousands of years, they know where every move leads. This is exciting because they don't have to depend on themselves. They have the guidebook that shows what will happen with each move, and therefore they don't have to make the mistakes. But Bruce is making a mistake. And the mistake that he keeps making is a category error. Earlier, he said that conservatives are like progressives. Conservatives are like progressives because they want to take away your freedoms. And I would say, again, the historical record shows the single greatest freedom produced in nations has been because conservative Christians, sometimes not even people who are religious, but just abiding by Judeo-Christian tradition, have chosen to make those virtues the law of the land. So again, I'll ask Bruce. Bruce, can you give me an example where classical liberalism has led to societal flourishing?
I'm not sure that there is any society ever that has lived purely by classical liberal ideas. It's an experiment that hasn't been done. But there is a society in which conservative norms and classical liberal ideas have coexisted. And that is ours. If you look, for example, through time, perhaps starting around the Victorian era, maybe not starting there, it includes the short history of Western civilization that you're probably familiar with. The Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution. There are big changes in those years. And we start with traditions of certain kinds, and that things evolve. And the ideas that the conservatives of the day would have had in 1 year, if you look 100 years later, it's different. As it will be different today. And so I don't want to allow Dave to get away with this 1,000 years of history thing. Just not true. If you look thousands of years ago about what was going on, you'll see things like slavery. Now, I know that Dave is not endorsing slavery. My point is that this is selective. It's not because we go to 1,000 years ago. It's because 1,000 years ago, lots of things were happening. And some of those things conservatives like, and some of those things they don't. And they ditch the ones they don't, and they embrace the ones they do. I'm telling you, it's arbitrary. It's not based on some plan. It's just what they like now. Going back to my examples before. Gay sex. Prohibition. These were conservative ideas. I'm not saying they're going to arise again, but you're going to get the same idea. Let's make something concrete. Dave has talked at length about how, and I must make a point first, that the approach Dave has taken is a very utilitarian one. It's actually not conservative at all. It's utilitarian. Here's what I mean by that. He's advocating a certain approach, and he said this in his opening. He's advocating a certain approach because, he says, it works. Okay? That's utilitarian. It's not virtue, it's not value, it's utilitarian. We want a certain result, this one will work, let's do it. But for completeness, let me describe to you how the classical liberal thing works in terms of battling the woke. Conservatives love institutions, public institutions. And public institutions are, at least in good part, government institutions. Why? Because they're created by government, or they might be funded by government, or they're supervised by government. In some way, they're a part of government. Public universities, for example, public schools, public hospitals, professional regulators, sort of independent, but not really, they're really part of government. And conservatives love public institutions because they do exactly what Dave is describing. They have knowledgeable people, wise people, who tell other people what to do. That's the model. And here's the way the plan that Dave is describing works when it comes to trying to save institutions from the woke. You get legislation that tells the institutions, well, you can't do it that way. Like in the States, for example, they pass bills that tell public universities, well, you can't do diversity, equity, and inclusion that way. You can't have those officers. They're trying to reform the institution. In this country, the conservatives, and I'm using small c conservatives now, conservatives want to reform the CBC. Why? Because the CBC is woke. Because it's no longer a news organization, it's captured by government, and so on. And I agree with those criticisms. But they're determined to reform the institution according to their values. Here's what a classical liberal would do. Those public institutions, those government institutions, should not exist. The CBC should be gone. Don't reform it. Don't cut its budget. Don't give it directives. It's not going to fix itself. It's funded by the government. It's a propaganda machine. Get rid of it. The classical liberal solution is don't have them. If you have public universities that are making a mess of things, that are heavy, it's heavy into the DEI. It's a public university. It's being funded, at least in good part, by government money. Take the money away. Make it a private university. And if it can carry on doing all this nonsense as a private university, taking the money just from its students or the like, well then so be it. Because they are free people too. Just don't be part of the problem. The classical liberal solution is to get the government out of it, because the government is the first problem in this whole thing. The woke problem is a government problem. Not only, but if you had government out of it, including all its money, all its interference, all its institutions, we'd be an awful lot further ahead than we are right now.
Bruce made me think of something. He was saying that I'm being utilitarian. Utilitarian is where you look at the consequence of something and then you deem it right or not. And he said, that's disingenuous. He said, you're playing a different game, Haskell. Now, I'm reading a little bit into what he was saying, but he's saying, you're playing a different game, Haskell. You're making a consequentialist argument when in fact you're categorical. So let me explain that just a little bit. A consequentialist argument is one based on the consequences. A categorical argument really is an argument from virtue. And he's right to say, maybe I should make that argument for a moment. The argument that there are certain categorical imperatives, there are certain ontological values that a person who is a conservative in the Judeo-Christian tradition will never, ever transgress. And I want you to know about that because it will show you that your safest government is one that is abiding by the traditional virtues of the Judeo-Christian tradition. You see, the reason that conservatives are not progressives, the reason that they will never become capricious authoritarians is because of this guy named Jesus. And Jesus, they actually take what he says. They take what he says seriously. In fact, they take it as commands. And he makes all these very impractical commands, like extend justice to the people you don't like. Extend tolerance to the people you don't like. And Bruce is right to say that Christians over time have gotten it wrong. But because the seeds of those ideas are right there in those commands, they keep coming back to it and they keep improving. And so we look and we say, who should we trust with the keys of government? Is it someone who has the ontological, the categorical command that they have to treat everybody equally, that they have to extend freedom to all? Is that the kind of people you want running your government? Is that the kind of virtue that should be the first responsibility of government to promote? I would hope that you'd say yes.
So I think I'm going to ask Dave a question, because he's asked me a couple. He's relied a lot, maybe entirely, upon the precepts of Christianity as a guidebook for how everybody, and I mean everybody, is going to have to live. So my question for him is, how do you justify that to someone who does not believe in Christianity? Like, I mean, at all. People are allowed not to believe in Christianity. They're not allowed, or shouldn't be allowed, to attack other people and take their stuff. But they're allowed not to believe, surely. They're allowed, surely, in a liberal society, not to believe. So my question for Dave is, how do you justify imposing Christianity as a legal code, not a moral code, but a legal code on people who reject that belief?
That's a great question. I guess we'd have to look at how did it occur in the past? How was it the case that up until the Second World War, explicit Christian virtues informed the laws of our lands? Actually still do in terms of justice, equality, they still do. How did that work? Well, again, Christianity is unique in that it says you must respect the rights of others, even those who don't believe. And if you want to see the proof that people outside of our nation, people outside the West, already understand that, look at the people who are flooding in as immigrants to Canada. People who do not share the Christian faith, but do share the desire to have freedom and equality and know that here, almost exclusively, is where you'll experience it. And it's not because of 17th century philosophers who wrote down some ideas about Enlightenment classical liberalism, but it's because of a tradition that goes back thousands of years that freed slaves, frees people today, and insists that you must do to others what you want done to yourself. So I'm mindful of the shrinking sands in my hourglass, and accordingly, this will probably be my closing statement of the debate, although I have a few more questions that will try to tie up the time for Bruce, but I'm not going to put those out just yet. I've occasionally said over the course of our time together that classical liberalism has a reality problem. In my last few minutes, I'll be explaining a final reality that classical liberalism has not accounted for, but will have to contend with. The reality is that in one way or another, conservatism wins. Now, I'm not claiming that I won this debate. My claim that conservatism wins extends far beyond this debate into society as a whole. And my claim is based on the best demographic and sociological evidence. That conservative wins, I will show, is a demographic and sociological inevitability. Let's talk demography. The countries of the West are not producing children at a level to replace older generations who are dying. Although countries of the West are leading in the downward race, this depopulation crisis is a worldwide phenomenon. Following current trends, in 50 years, only 26 countries out of a world total of 195 will still have more births than deaths. And all of those countries, almost all, are in Africa. But amid this overall population collapse is a striking exception. The exception is most pronounced in the West. So let's just look at the countries of the West for a moment. In the West, conservative religious believers, on average, are having about twice as many children as non-religious people. And the greater level of religious conservatism, the more religious you are, the greater the number of kids. So let me give you some statistics. According to the Institute for Family Studies out of the University of Virginia, in the U.S., Bible-believing Protestants will, quote, more than double in size over the next generation, even without the addition of immigrants. Now, you've likely heard that Christianity is in decline in the West, and that is true at the level of current numbers. But most of that decline is exclusively reserved to liberal Protestant denominations and Catholic churches. The other churches that are of a more conservative bent are bucking the trend. Again, the most devout evangelical believers, these are conservative Protestants, are doubling almost every 20 to 25 years. That same growth pattern, doubling about every 25 years, is seen in Old Order Amish Mennonites, ultra-Orthodox Jews, and devout Muslims. Related to Muslims, the Pew Research Center out of Washington concludes, quote, by 2050, the U.S. Muslim population will replace Jews as the second largest religious group in America, as it reaches nearly twice the share of today. Now, let me contrast the growing fertility of religious conservatives with the fertility trends of other citizens in the West. All the evidence shows that the higher your agreement with progressive values, the lower the number of children that you have. In particular, progressives with the strongest views on climate change and societal oppression have begun to adopt explicitly anti-natal, anti-children positions. So that's the demographic reality. Conservatives in society are having about double the babies of all others. But beyond demographics, the sociological reality also points to a conservative win. Simply put, conservative religious believers are the most successful at passing along their values to their children and keeping them in their community. They are least likely to lose children to the secular culture. However, this same claim cannot be made of parents who are classical liberal in orientation. The overwhelming evidence shows parents who take the classical liberal approach, which is primarily a morally relative approach or a live and let live approach, on average, lose their children to the ideology of the current progressive culture. Yes, there are exceptions, but decades of hard data show that parents who do not purposefully and repeatedly transmit an overarching moral narrative to their children will lose them to another overarching narrative that is more aggressively promoted. Have you been to public schools lately? So I've just shown that the demographic and the sociological data strongly support my claim of a conservative win. One way or another, we're destined to see conservatism become the strongest influence in our government, laws, and culture. But even though I'm arguing the conservative position, that does not give me comfort. And here's why. First of all, will that conservative, virtuous groundswell of political policy come soon enough? You see, wokeism is a powerful, all-encompassing ideology. It's dedicated to division. We're already seeing the fruits of that terrible ideology. It teaches hate for those it calls enemies, and it will use authoritarian means to punish them. It already has, and it'll continue. And currently it's winning. So will this virtuous, conservative governing come soon enough? We have to realize that only a more powerful, more encompassing ideology can beat this other progressive ideology. Moral relativism will not do it. But what ideology will it be? And that brings me to my second major concern. You see, it's not certain that the Judeo-Christian worldview, the worldview that fostered freedom and equality, that worldview that allowed the West to flourish. We can't say that it will be the new conservative worldview that will come to dominate. In the multicultural West, there are now competing versions of conservatism, underpinned by faiths that are far less accommodating to ideological opponents. Gone are the precepts that you must treat everyone equally. Gone is the precept that even your enemies must be treated justly. Gone is freedom for all. Therefore, for all our sakes, I hope that classical liberalism does not carry the day. For all our sakes, we should want the first responsibility of government to be the promotion of virtue, but it must be the same virtues that historically brought success to the West.
Governments have been tyrants for a long time. But it is only relatively recently that anyone ever thought of governments as saviors. And that is what David is describing. That the government will come in and save us. You know where that idea originated, arguably? Early in the 20th century, in the United States, by a president named Woodrow Wilson. The transformation of the idea of government as servant to the idea of government as savior. And Woodrow Wilson was the first American progressive president. The idea of government as savior is a progressive idea. And that is what the plan is based on. Governments should get out of the way. Governments should be servants of the people. Your government is not your savior. Your savior is your savior. And don't mix them up. Davis suggested that one of the principles, if not the principle, upon which this conservative regime, this Christian regime, would be based in the law, is that it should respect the rights of others who do not believe. That was his answer to my question. Respect the rights of others who do not believe. Now, if that was true, we wouldn't have a dispute, because that's what I've been describing. The ability of people to decide for themselves without having to believe in a certain set of behavioral codes. And I would suggest to you that Dave doesn't mean this. I'm going to say it again. Respect the rights of others who do not believe. Let's make this concrete. If I get old and infirm and uncomfortable, I want to be able to arrange my own death. Under a conservative regime, like David's describing, do you think that will be legal? No. Why? Because it's not virtuous. It's not virtuous in the Christian tradition. That is not respecting the rights of people who do not agree. That's patting them on the head and saying, well, I'm very sorry, we respect you, but too bad. This idea is based upon the heavy hand of government. And that heavy hand of government as savior is the one that Woodrow Wilson unleashed and eventually transformed American and Western society into the administrative state we have now, the nanny state that controls, directs, supervises, does all the things that Dave wants it to do. And that has been the problem. We don't have the society that the founders of the United States imagined. Now, that society was not perfect either, of course. It had slavery, for example. But there was an idea in there. It wasn't exclusively liberal, but it was the beginning of the idea of people owning their own lives. That was respecting the rights of others who do not agree. Here's still the problem. And it's the problem between Dave and I, and it's the problem for the people in the room and the people out there, all of us who are trying to figure out a way to resist what is happening to our society, to our civilization. And tonight we've been trying to explain ourselves to each other and to you. As I said earlier, when you get right down to it, the problem from the liberal point of view is that the woke are illiberal and have taken away our freedom. Our problem is not enough freedom. From the conservative point of view, the problem of the woke is not illiberalism, it is immoralism. I'm not sure that's a word, but you get the point. And their diagnosis is too much freedom. And here's the problem. Those two things can't come together and meet in the middle, because in the middle of those two positions are the woke. We are on opposite ends of this problem. And if we were to succeed by some miracle, then what would happen? We would be opposing each other. We would become each other's opponents, because the premise of the programs are completely different. And so we need a solution. Because it's probable that if we continue on trying to resist the woke together with two completely different ideas about what the problem is, then we're going to splinter. And, even if we were together, the job is very difficult, maybe even unlikely. But split, impossible. I can tell you that people who believe in liberty will fight tooth and nail for it. We can fight the woke tooth and nail for it together, or we can fight amongst ourselves. Those people who believe in liberty are not going to accept the idea that a bunch of conservatives are going to come along and tell them to be Christian. That's not going to happen. And it is understandable why so many of the progressives think conservatives are dangerous. They think that for this very reason. You won't let it go. There's a determination that everybody will act in accordance with our code. That is a recipe for failure. I can tell you that because I'm against it. I'm against it vehemently. I will oppose that with the enthusiasm with which I oppose the woke. It is a non-starter. It won't work. So unless we can come together with some idea about what we're trying to do, this is doomed to failure. I'm going to give Dave his last 2 minutes.
Bruce has raised the concern that government might make you do things you don't want to do. And so I'm going to again remind you of the reality of the situation. In a nation, government does that. And whether or not you accept the virtues and values of the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's not whether you're going to accept a doctrine. You will. Because it's not whether you will be compelled to accept a doctrine, it's which doctrine. And now, I think that what Bruce is missing is that with the classical liberal position, he's actually creating the environment for tyranny. And he's doing that by creating a moral vacuum. And as society becomes more like San Francisco and Toronto, Vancouver, Seattle, it actually creates the precondition for people to accept an authoritarian regime, a dictator. So there are going to be constraints. Conservatism, as guided by the Judeo-Christian tradition, asks people to make constraints, and it's going to make choices that you don't agree with, especially if you're not a religious believer. But ultimately, through the vindication of history, those people who support those policies will say, actually, we're playing chess. We've got the guidebook. We can tell you which way this is going to go. So with that, I asked Bruce one more question. Actually, I won't even ask him another question. It's not fair. But I hope you appreciate that I'm done.
I have a huge amount of respect for this man. As I said at the beginning, he's one of the finest human beings that I know. And I don't know the background to how he arrived at where he is, but I admire it. But my criticism, I think, is that his plan is not giving other people the credit to be able to do what he did. He came to his realizations, whatever they happen to be, in an environment, in a culture that is going downhill like we've both been describing. It wasn't because the law said to David Haskell, you must do this, or you must believe that. That wasn't the case at all. Whatever the influences upon Dave, family, friends, church, community, he took all those in and came to the conclusions that he's come to. All I'm saying is that that's what people should do. That's what people should have the freedom to do. The conservative plan is not to do that. The conservative plan is to demand that you believe this and do it that way. And denying to all the other people the process of deciding what is right and good and true. If I may say so, it's kind of arrogant, kind of elitist. The presumption is this: there are a group of us who know the truth, who know best, who know the tradition, who know the teachings, and we know for the rest of you, this is what you should do. That's unfair. It's undemocratic. It's elitist. And it's not free. I'm suggesting that everybody have the choice to do what Dave has done himself. And if they come to the same conclusions, then fantastic. Because then we have a society of human beings that I certainly will admire. But you can't dictate cultural norms. That's not how cultures work. Cultures evolve. You can't just put it into a legal code and have it happen. You know that old truism, that law is downstream from politics and politics is downstream from culture. If you want all this to happen, you have to fix the culture. And you don't do that by putting it all in legislation. And with that, I think I'll conclude. Thank you very much.